Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Michael Greger coming to you live from my treadmill for my second webinar of 2020. They've been so successful, so popular that your wish is my command. We have a whole series of webinars coming up this year. Currently, I'm on a 200-city speaking tour for the next 10 months. In fact, let me paste that into the chat box, the link to my speaking schedule here. Just today, we actually updated the whole speaking tour schedule, which is both on, let me give you the Nutrition Facts one. We just put it on Nutrition Facts. Let me pull that up. That's even better. Speaking dates. Ta-da! Here, try that one instead. That's even better. So that just went up today, that page, and you can look at it on a calendar form or as a list form and see where I'm going to be and register and all that stuff. Anyway, and note that those are only the confirmed dates. We have dozens more cities that are going to be added. So keep checking back if I don't appear to be in your neighborhood soon. But wait a second. 200 cities in like 10 months? How can I keep making videos? Well, I mean, why isn't NutritionFacts.org just a blank white screen all year? Well, what I do is I queue up a whole year's worth of videos in advance. So I'm sitting on this whole stack of videos, all this exciting, interesting, and practical, groundbreaking stuff that I just can't wait to get into people's hands. And it makes me want to Netflix and drop the whole season at once so everyone can binge watch. And that's kind of what these webinars are. For those who don't want to wait, I spill a bunch of videos at once, and then you can get to answer any questions anyone may have. And as a bonus, I get a day where I'm not sitting in an airplane. So it's a win-win. Today's webinar is entitled, Why Do Vegetarians Have Higher Stroke Risk? Frankly, I was hoping I'd never have to do this video, I'm like a behind the scenes ghost fact checker for many popular nutrition books and documentaries. I plead with people to pretty please let me fact check their stuff for free to help kind of raise the bar. All it takes is for one person to make some exaggeration, and it makes everyone else look bad. And the industry is more than happy to jump on it and convince people to throw the baby out with the bathwater and dismiss the entire field out of hand. And one of the most common errors that I have to correct is a sentence that reads something like this: plant-based diets are associated with low risk of heart disease and cancer and stroke and dementia, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. And I have to be yes to all that, except we can't say lower stroke incidence because it's never been put to the test. And there was even reason to suspect that it might not be true. In fact, I called it 17 years ago. There's an old video of me on YouTube, and you can tell it's from 2003 by both my cutting edge use of advanced whiteboard technology and the fact that I still had hair. In that video, I was worried that we might not like what we found if we actually measured stroke incidence in vegetarians and vegans. And recently, when researchers actually did, my fears were realized. The good news is I think there's an easy fix. And that's what we're going to cover right now. By the end of this webinar today, you will know everything there is to know in the peer-reviewed scientific literature on why vegetarians may have higher stroke risk and what we can do about it. But first, some housekeeping logistics. If you can't hear me right now, there are instructions in the email that was sent out last week to tweak your audio settings. But if you can't hear me right now and don't have your closed captions on, then let me paste that into the chat box. There we go. If at any time you run into technical difficulties, there are live chat Zoom staff standing by. Let me paste that link in there. And if they're unable to help, we have Nutrition Facts staff standing by too, though presumably if the Zoom people can't help, I mean, it's their platform. I don't know if we'll be able to help either, but we want to give you as many possible avenues as possible so you make sure this is as seamless as an experience as possible. Please reserve the Q&A button you see in the Zoom window to ask content questions. There should be lots of time for our Q&A at the end, but feel free to add questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. Certainly, we don't want you to forget them. And the NutritionFacts.org team will be compiling them to be answered at the end. You may want to wait to see if I cover a topic that might be coming up later in the webinar, but again, feel free to post anytime. You can find a list of the topics that I will be covering today on the webinar page, which you presumably all signed up through. I'll paste that URL in case you wanted to check back and kind of see what's coming down the pike today. The webinar will go on for 2 hours, 2 super quick, way too fast hours. But we will be taking one 5-minute break on the hour. So at 3 p.m. Eastern time, we'll take a break and then we'll wrap it at 4. So if you have to pee and it's like 2:55, if you can just hold it for 5 minutes, you won't have to miss anything. So let me just remind people by pasting that, pasting that in the chat box too. Let me just check in to make sure there's no major onboarding problems and most people got in okay. Let me just peek. Oh, sweet. We have, looks like more than 500 folks on the line. And looks like we're doing okay. Okay, welcome everyone. Awesome. You don't have to take you don't have to worry about taking notes or anything because after the webinar is over, not only are we going to send you a full recording of the whole webinar as you're watching right now, but also a free link to download all the videos in high def so you can see the videos in their full resolution glory. Let's start out with some background on stroke. Which foods are associated with lower risk and which foods are have actually been put to the test. Let me see, where's my, there it is. Okay. Strokes are one of the leading causes of death and disability in the world, the most common cause of seizures in the elderly, and the second most common cause of dementia, and a frequent cause of major depression. In short, stroke is a burdensome but preventable brain disorder. According to the Global Burden of Disease Study, the largest study of risk factors for human disease in history, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, more than 90% of the stroke burden is attributable to modifiable risk factors, though some are easier to modify than others. For example, about 10% of all healthy years of life lost due to stroke may be due to ambient air pollution. So yeah, I mean, technically that's a modifiable risk factor. You could just move, out of the city to some place with cleaner air, but perhaps easier to just quit smoking, which accounts for 18% of the stroke death and disability, about as much as diets high in sodium. Diets high in salt are as bad as smoking when it comes to stroke burden, but not as bad as inadequate fruit and vegetable consumption. Yes, there's also other things like sedentary lifestyles, which is not as bad as not eating enough whole grains, but of the 89% of the stroke death and disability that's attributable to modifiable risk factors, fully half appears to be due just to not eating enough fruits and veggies. Fruit and vegetable consumption is associated with a lower risk of about a dozen different diseases, and stroke is way up there. Right? There appears to be a linear dose-response relationship, a straight-line relationship between more fruits and vegetables and lower stroke risk, suggesting that the risk of stroke decreases by 32% for every 200-gram increase in fruits. That's just like 1 apple a day, and 11% lower risk for each equivalent amount of vegetables. Particularly potent citrus fruits, apples and pears, and dark green leafy vegetables, one of which you can drink, the green leaves of green tea. Right? Drinking 3 cups of green tea a day is associated with an 18% lower stroke risk. But association doesn't necessarily mean causation. Have there ever been any vegetables put to the test in randomized controlled trials? Yes. Garlic is so potent you can stuff garlic powder into a capsule or compress it into a tablet, so you can put it head-to-head against a sugar pill, and garlic beat out placebo for the prevention of CIMT progression, meaning that the thickening of the major artery walls to the neck going up to the brain, a key predictor of stroke risk. Continuing to worsen in the placebo group, but not the garlic group that had been taking just a quarter teaspoon of garlic powder a day. That would cost about, a penny a day, and just make your food yummier anyway. OK, but has there ever been an interventional trial that's actually followed people out to prove that a certain food reduced strokes? Yes, nuts. The PrettyMed study showed that an ounce a day of nuts, which is what I recommend in my daily dozen, cuts stroke risk nearly in half. But wait, PrettyMed? Wait a second. Wasn't that the study that was retracted? The PrettyMed trial is one of the most influential randomized trials ever. Yet in 2018, it was retracted only to be later republished after making the necessary corrections. Due to irregularities in their randomization procedures, the original paper was withdrawn, but in their reanalysis, they found the same results. The same 46% fall in stroke risk in the added nuts group, dropping the 10-year risk of stroke from about 6% down to 3%. The good news is that stroke risk can be reduced substantially by an active lifestyle, cessation of smoking, and a healthy diet. All we have to do now is educate and convince people on the benefits that can be expected from healthy lifestyle and nutrition. OK, to recap, exercise, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, especially citrus, apples and pears, and dark green leafy vegetables, green tea, garlic, and nuts. These are all things we should strive to include into our daily routines. Now, besides smoking and salt, is there anything else we should avoid? That's the subject of my next video, what not to eat for stroke prevention. Oh, I should have stopped the sharing so everyone can see me instead of a white screen. Sorry about that. OK, but now let's go back and see the next video. The large majority of the available evidence is in favor of a protective association between fruit and vegetable consumption and the risk of stroke. The worst foods appear to be meat and soda. Eating like a burger for lunch and a pork chop for dinner, 2 breakfast sausage links, and a typical 20-ounce bottle of soda may increase stroke risk by 60%. Reviewers suggest the meat effect may be the saturated fat or cholesterol, the iron-mediated oxidized fat, or the salt, but it could also be the TMAO, the carnitine in meat, and the choline in dairy, seafood, and especially eggs is converted by our gut bacteria into trimethylamine, which is oxidized by our liver to TMAO, which may then contribute to heart attacks, stroke, and death. And indeed, in a 2019 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, following tens of thousands of Americans for a median of about 17 years, up to a maximum of 31 years, found that higher consumption of dietary cholesterol or eggs was significantly associated with higher risk of incident cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality in a dose-response manner, meaning those who ate more eggs or consumed more cholesterol in general appeared to live significantly shorter lives on average, and the more eggs, the worse it was. And this includes egg consumption and stroke. But that's not what a meta-analysis funded by the egg industry found. It turns out that such meta-analyses have evidently been flawed by major methodological drawbacks. So, to eat or not to eat, it would seem moderation of egg consumption is called for, along with other sources of dietary cholesterol, given the new study data, which had the advantage of a longer follow-up than the majority of the previous studies, and may therefore have provided more power to detect associations. Similarly, with meta-analyses of dairy, no apparent link emerged, but evidence of publication bias was found, meaning there appeared to be missing studies, potentially shelved by industry-funded researchers for not showing funder-friendly effects. Researchers studying the relationship between funding sources and conclusions in studies of sugary drinks and milk found that studies funded by the likes of Coca-Cola and the Dairy Council had over 7 times the likelihood of coming to funder-friendly conclusions than independent research, which is twice as bad as drug companies. Big Pharma only seems to be able to get away with a 3-fold bias. Of particular interest, not a single one of the interventional studies looking at soda or milk ended up with an unfavorable conclusion. The bottom line is that yes, dairy fat may be better than other animal fats, such as those found in meat, but something like whole grains would be better still, though swapping dairy out for refined grains or added sugar wouldn't be doing you many favors. When it comes to stroke risk, vegetable fat is better than dairy fat, meat fat is the worst, whole grains are better, and fish fat, added sugars, and refined grains are statistically about the same. In terms of dietary patterns in stroke, most of the studies on plant-based dietary patterns have found a protective effect against stroke, whereas those looking at westernized patterns, those based more on animal foods and added sugars and fats, found a detrimental effect of adherence to westernized patterns. African Americans are 5 times as likely to die from stroke in middle age, a black-white disparity largely driven by the fact that they're just having so many more strokes. In this population, a Southern-style diet characterized by a lot of fried foods and meat may be playing a role in increasing the risk of stroke, whereas adherence to more plant-based diets may reduce stroke risk. Yes, wrote the director of the Stroke Prevention and Atherosclerosis Research Center, learning to make vegetarian meals every other day is a tall order for most North Americans, but is feasible given tasty recipes and a positive attitude. OK, so plants, like fruits and vegetables, appear to decrease risk, and animal foods like meat and eggs appear to increase risk. Animal fats are worse than plant fats, and more plant-based eating patterns appear to be protective. So those who don't eat any meat at all should be doing great. So wait, do vegetarians really have higher stroke risk? Let's see what the data says. When ranked in order of importance, among the interventions available to prevent stroke, the 3 most important are probably diet, smoking cessation, and blood pressure control. Most of us are doing pretty good on smoking these days. Less than half of us are exercising enough, but according to the American Heart Association, only 1 in 1,000 Americans are eating a healthy diet, and fewer than 1 in 10 are even eating a moderately healthy diet. Why does it matter? Because diet is an important part of stroke prevention. Reducing sodium intake, avoiding egg yolks, limiting the intake of meat, and increasing the intake of whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and lentils. Like the sugar industry, the meat and egg industry spend hundreds of millions of dollars on propaganda, unfortunately with great success. I was excited to check out box number 1, and was then honored when I did. The strongest evidence for stroke protection is for increasing fruit and vegetable intake, with more uncertainty regarding the role of whole grains, animal products, and dietary patterns such as vegetarian diets. I mean, one would expect they'd do great. Meta-analyses have found that vegetarian diets lower cholesterol, and blood pressure, and enhance weight loss and blood sugar control, and vegan diets may work even better. So all the key biomarkers are going in the right direction, but you may be surprised to learn that there hadn't ever been any studies on the incidence of stroke in vegetarians and vegans until now. And if you think that's surprising, wait until you hear the results. The risks of heart disease and stroke in meat eaters, fish eaters, and vegetarians over 18 years of follow-up. Yes, less heart disease among vegetarians, by which they mean vegetarians and vegans combined. No surprise, been there, done that, but more stroke. An understandable knee-jerk reaction might be, wait a second, who did this study? But this is Epic Oxford, world-class researchers whose conflicts of interest may be more likely to read, I was a member of the Vegan Society. What about over-adjustment? I mean, if you crunch the numbers, over a 10-year period, they found 15 strokes for every 1,000 meat eaters, compared to only 9 strokes for every 1,000 vegetarians and vegans. Wait, so how can they say there was more strokes in the vegetarians? This was after adjusting for a variety of factors. For example, the vegetarians were less likely to smoke, so you want to cancel that out by adjusting for smoking, so that you can effectively compare the stroke risk of non-smoking vegetarians to non-smoking meat eaters. Right? If you want to know how a vegetarian diet itself affects stroke rates, you want to cancel out these non-diet related factors. Sometimes, though, you can over-adjust. The sugar industry does it all the time. This is how it works. Imagine you just got a grant from the soda industry to study the effects of soda on the childhood obesity epidemic. I mean, what could you possibly do after putting all the studies together to arrive at the conclusion that there was near zero effect of sugary beverage consumption on body weight? Well, since you know that drinking liquid candy can lead to excess calories that can lead to obesity, if you control for calories, if you control for a factor that's in the causal chain, effectively only comparing soda drinkers who take in the same number of calories as non-soda drinkers, right? Then you could undermine the soda to obesity effect. And that's exactly what they did. That introduces over-adjustment bias. Right? Instead of just controlling for some unrelated factor, you control for an intermediate variable on the cause and effect pathway between exposure and outcome. Right? Over-adjustment is how meat and dairy industry-funded researchers have been accused of obscuring the true association between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. Right? We know that saturated fat increases cholesterol, which increases heart disease risk. Therefore, if you control for cholesterol, effectively only comparing saturated fat eaters with the same cholesterol levels as non-saturated fat eaters, you see how you can undermine the saturated fat to heart disease effect. Right? Now let's get back to this. Since vegetarian eating lowers blood pressure, and a lowered blood pressure leads to less stroke, controlling for blood pressure would be an over-adjustment, effectively only comparing vegetarians to meat eaters with the same low blood pressure. Right? That's not fair, right? Since that's one of the benefits of vegetarian eating, not some unrelated factor like smoking, and so it would undermine the afforded protection. So did they do that? No. They only adjusted for unrelated factors like education and socioeconomic class and smoking and exercise and alcohol, right? And that's what you want, right? You want to tease out the effects of a vegetarian diet on stroke risk, right? You want to try to equalize everything else to tease out the effects of just the dietary choice. And since, for example, meat eaters in the study were on average 10 years older than the vegetarians, you can totally see how, when you adjust for that, vegetarians could come out worse. Since stroke risk can increase exponentially with age, you can see how having 9 strokes among 1,000 vegetarians in their 40s could be worse than 15 strokes among 1,000 meat eaters in their 50s. The fact that vegetarians had greater stroke risk, despite their lower blood pressure, suggests there's something about meat-free diets that so increases stroke risk it's enough to cancel out the blood pressure benefits. But even if that's true, you still would want to eat that way. I mean, stroke is our 5th leading cause of death. whereas heart disease is number one. So yes, in this study, there were this many more cases of stroke in vegetarians, but there were this many fewer cases of heart disease. But if there is something increasing stroke risk in vegetarians, I mean, it'd be nice to know what it is. In hopes of figuring out how to get the best of both worlds, this is the question we'll turn to next. Okay, so the takeaway I was hoping people would get from that video is that indeed the phenomenon appears to be real. There really does seem to be higher stroke risk among vegetarians. Next, I'll explore the role of reverse causation, break down the subtype of strokes and the subtypes of vegetarians, cover stroke mortality, not just incidence, and ask if vitamin D may be playing a role. The risks of heart disease and stroke in meat eaters versus vegetarians over 18 years of follow-up. Not surprisingly, vegetarian diets were associated with less heart disease, 10 fewer cases per 1,000 people per decade compared to meat eaters, but vegetarian diets were associated with 3 more cases of stroke. So, I mean, eating vegetarian appears to lower the risk of cardiovascular disease by 7 overall, but why the extra stroke risk? I mean, could it just be reverse causation? For example, when studies have shown higher mortality among those who quit smoking compared to continuing smokers, we suspect reverse causality. When we see a link between quitting smoking and dying, instead of quitting smoking leading to people dying, more likely dying led people to quit smoking. Right? It's the same reason why non-drinkers can appear to have even more liver cirrhosis, because it was their failing liver that led them to stop drinking. Right? This is the so-called sick quitter effect, and you can see it when people quit meat, too. See how new vegetarians can appear to have more heart disease than non-vegetarians? Well, why would some older person all of a sudden start eating vegetarian? Maybe it's because they've just been diagnosed with heart disease. So that may be why there appears to be higher rates at first, the sick quitter effect. Right? To control for that, you can throw out the first 5 years of data to make sure the diet has a chance to start working. And indeed, when you do that, the true effect comes clear: significant drop in heart disease risk. So does that likely explain the apparent increased stroke risk? No, because they still found higher stroke risk even after the first 5 years. OK, then what's going on? Well, let's dive deeper into the data to look for clues. This is what you get when you break down the results by type of stroke and type of vegetarian versus vegan. There are 2 main types of strokes: ischemic strokes and hemorrhagic strokes. Now, most are ischemic strokes, or clotting strokes, where an artery in the brain gets clogged off, as opposed to hemorrhagic strokes, or bleeding strokes, where a blood vessel in the brain ruptures. In the United States, it's about 90-10. 9 out of 10 strokes are clotting, 1 out of 10 the bleeding type. And that's what the vegetarians appeared to have significantly more of. Now, the vegans didn't. In fact, statistically have significantly higher risk of any kind of stroke. But that's terrible news for vegans. Vegans have the same stroke risk as meat eaters? What's going on? Right? What's so increasing their stroke risk that it's offsetting all their natural advantages? And the same could be asked of vegetarians. Even though this was the first study of vegetarian stroke incidence, there have been about a half-dozen studies on stroke mortality, and the various meta-analyses have consistently found significantly lower heart disease risk, but the lower stroke mortality was not statistically significant. Now, with this new study, vegetarians can take comfort in the fact that at least they don't have a higher risk of dying from stroke, but that's terrible news for vegetarians. Well, what? Statistically, vegetarians have the same stroke death rate as meat eaters? What's going on? Right? What's so increasing their stroke rate that it's offsetting all their natural advantages? Right? OK, let's run through a couple possibilities. If you look at the vitamin D levels of vegetarians and vegans, they do tend to run consistently lower than meat eaters, and lower vitamin D status is associated with increased risk of stroke. But who has higher levels of the sunshine vitamin? Those who are outside running around and exercising. Maybe that's why their stroke risk is better. What we need are randomized studies, and when you look at people who've been effectively randomized at birth to have lifelong lower vitamin D levels just genetically, you do not see a clear indicator of increased stroke risk. So the link between vitamin D and stroke is probably not cause and effect. And so in terms of an answer to our question, vitamin D doesn't seem to fit, right? We'll explore some other possibilities next. OK, so if you have any questions about this reverse causation or that statistical over-adjustment I talked about in the last video, don't forget to click the Q&A button, and I'd, of course, be happy to dig a lot deeper into that. And I know it went quick, and remember, of course, you're going to get all these videos again, so you can watch them slower and pause whenever necessary. It may be worth reiterating that while vegetarians have a higher risk of having a stroke, they don't have a higher risk of dying from a stroke. But again, that's crazy, right? Meat is a risk factor for stroke. So how could cutting out meat lead to more strokes? There must be something about eating plant-based that so increases your stroke risk that it counterbalances the meat-free benefit. Might it be because vegetarians don't eat fish? We turn to omega-3s next. In my last video, we started to explore what might explain the higher stroke risk in vegetarians found in the EPIC Oxford study. A lower risk of heart disease and lower risk of cardiovascular disease overall, but higher risk of stroke. We looked into vitamin D levels as a potential mechanism, but that didn't seem to be the case. What about long-chain omega-3s, the fish fats like EPA and DHA found, not surprisingly, in markedly lower levels in vegetarians and vegans? About 30% lower in vegetarians and more like half as low in vegans. But according to the most extensive, systematic assessment of effects of omega-3 fats on cardiovascular health to date, there is no benefit for stroke, combining 28 randomized controlled trials, and in fact, there was evidence that taking fish oil didn't help with heart disease or overall mortality either. This may be because, on one hand, the omega-3s may be helping, but the mercury in fish may be making things worse. That's the constant challenge among public health professionals, balancing the benefits with the contaminant risks. For example, dietary exposure to PCBs may be associated with increased risk of stroke. In this study, for instance, neither fish nor intake of PCBs was related to stroke risk. However, at the same fish intake, dietary PCBs were associated with an increased risk of stroke, so the PCB pollutants may be masking the fish benefit. Thus, if we had a time machine and could go back before the Industrial Revolution and find fish in an unpolluted state, it might protect against stroke. But looking at the data, if fish really was protected, then we might expect that the pescatarians, those who eat fish but no other meat, to be down, I don't know, here or something, right? Since they would have the fish benefit without the meat risk, but no, they're stuck out here. Right? So it doesn't seem to be the omega-3s either. Let's take a closer look at what the vegetarians were actually eating. When it comes to plant-based diets for cardiovascular disease prevention, all plant foods are not created equal. There are basically two types of vegetarians, those that do it for their health, and those who do it for ethical reasons, right, for like global warming or animals, and they tend to eat different diets, right? So for example, health vegans tend to eat more fruit and less sweets. You don't tend to see those doing it for health chowing down on vegan donuts. Right? In the United States, the primary motivations for meat reduction are health and cost. Middle-class American families 4 times more likely to reduce meat for health reasons compared to environmental or animal welfare concerns. But in the UK, where the stroke study was done, the #1 reason given for becoming vegetarian or vegan is ethics. We know plant-based diets that emphasize higher intakes of plant foods and lower intakes of animal foods are associated with a lower risk of incident cardiovascular diseases, a lower risk of dying from all causes put together, but that's only for healthy plant foods. Eating lots of Wonder Bread soda and apple pie isn't going to be doing you many favors. For all types of plant-based diets, it's crucial that the choice of plant foods is given careful consideration. We should be choosing whole grains over refined grains, whole fruits, avoiding trans fats and added sugars. Could it be that the veggie Brits were just eating more chips? We'll find out next. OK, another strikeout in terms of the omega-3s in terms of trying to explain the increased risk. Could it be that the vegetarians were eating particularly unhealthy diets? I mean, as a physician, labels like vegetarian or vegan just tell me what you don't eat, right? There's lots of unhealthy vegetarian foods out there, like French fries and soda pop, right? That's why I prefer the term whole food, plant-based nutrition. That tells me what you do eat. Oh, you actually eat vegetables, right? A diet centered around the healthiest foods out there. But is that what was going on? Let's find out. Plant-based diets are associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, mortality, and dying from all causes put together. This study of a diverse sample of 12,000 Americans found that progressively increasing the intake of plant foods by reducing the intake of animal foods may be associated with benefits on cardiovascular health and mortality. But when it comes to plant-based diets for cardiovascular disease prevention, all plant foods are not created equal. Were the vegetarians in the British study that found the higher stroke risk just eating a lot of vegan junk food? Any diet devoid of certain animal food sources can be claimed to be a vegetarian or vegan diet, so it's important to see what they were actually eating. One of the first things I look at when I'm trying to see how serious a population is about healthy eating is look at something undeniably, uncontroversially bad: soda, liquid candy. Anyone drinking straight sugar water obviously doesn't have health top of mind. In the big study of plant-based eaters in America, where people tend to cut down on meat for health reasons far more than ethics, flexitarians drink fewer sugary beverages than regular meat eaters, as do pescatarians, vegetarians, and vegans. In the UK study, though, where the increased stroke risk was found, where folks are more likely to go veg or vegan for ethical reasons, the pescatarians are drinking less soda, but the vegetarians and vegans are drinking more. Now, I'm not saying that's why they had more strokes. It just might give us an idea of how healthy the people were eating. In the UK study, the vegetarians and vegan men and women were eating about the same amount of desserts, cookies, and chocolate, and about the same total sugar. In the US study, the average non-vegetarian is nearly obese. Even the vegetarians are a little overweight, and the vegans were the only ideal weight group. In this analysis of the UK study, though, everyone was about the same weight. In fact, the meat eaters were skinnier than the vegans. The Epic Oxford study seems to have attracted a particularly health-conscious group of meat eaters, weighing substantially less than the general population. Let's look at some particular stroke-related nutrients. Dietary fiber appears beneficial for the prevention of cardiovascular disease, including stroke, and it appears the more, the better. Based on studies of nearly 500,000 men and women, there doesn't seem to be any upper threshold of benefit. So the more, the better. More than 25 grams of soluble fiber, 47 grams of insoluble dietary fiber, and you can really start seeing a significant drop in associated stroke risk. So one could consider these as the minimal recommendable daily intakes to prevent stroke at a population level. That's what you see in people eating diets centered around minimally processed plant foods. Dean Ornish got up around there with his whole food plant-based diet. Maybe not as much as we were designed to eat based on the analysis of fossilized feces, but that's the kind of neighborhood where we might expect significantly lower stroke risk. How much were the UK vegetarians getting? 22.1.
Now, in the UK, they measured fiber a little differently, so that may actually be closer to 30 grams, but not the optimal level for stroke prevention. So little fiber that the vegetarians and vegans only beat out the meat eaters by about 1 or 2 bowel movements a week, suggesting they were eating lots of processed foods. The vegetarians were only eating about a half serving more of fruits and vegetables, thought to reduce stroke risk in part because of their potassium content. Yet the UK vegetarians at higher stroke risk were evidently eating so few greens and beans they couldn't even match the meat eaters, not even reaching the recommended minimum daily potassium intake of 4,700 milligrams a day. And what about sodium? Right? The vast majority of the available evidence indicates that elevated salt intake is associated with higher stroke risk. There's like a straight-line increase in the risk of dying from stroke the more salt you eat. Even just lowering sodium intake by a tiny fraction every year could prevent tens of thousands of fatal strokes. Reducing sodium intake to prevent stroke. Time for action, not hesitation. But the UK vegetarians and vegans appeared to be hesitating, as did the other dietary groups. All groups exceeded the advised less than 2,400 milligrams of daily sodium intake, and that doesn't even account for salt added at the table. And the American Heart Association recommends under just 1,500 a day. So they were all eating lots of processed food. So no wonder the vegetarian blood pressures were only 1 or 2 points lower. And high blood pressure is perhaps the single most important modifiable risk factor for stroke. What evidence do I have that if the vegetarians and vegans ate better, their stroke risk would go down? Well, in rural Africa, where they were able to nail the fiber intake that their bodies were designed to get by eating so many whole healthy plant foods, fruits, vegetables, grains, greens, and beans, their protein almost entirely from plant sources, not only was heart disease, our #1 killer, almost non-existent, so apparently was stroke, surging up from out of nowhere with the introduction of salt and refined foods to their diet. Stroke also appears to be virtually absent in Catava, a quasi-vegan island culture near Australia, where diet was very low in salt and very rich in potassium, because it was a vegetable-based diet. They ate fish a few times a week, but the other 95% or so of their diet was lots of vegetables, fruits, corn, and beans, and they had an apparent absence of stroke, even despite their ridiculous rates of smoking. After all, we evolved eating as little as less than 1/8 of a teaspoon a day of salt, and our daily potassium consumption is thought to have been as high as 10,000 milligrams. Right? We went from an unsalted, whole food diet to salty processed foods depleted of potassium, whether we eat meat or not. Right? Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic tried putting about 200 patients with established cardiovascular disease on a whole food plant-based diet. Of the 177 that stuck with the diet, only 1 went on to have a stroke in the subsequent few years, compared to a 100-fold greater rate of adverse events, including multiple strokes and deaths, in those that strayed from the diet. This is not vegetarianism. Esselstyn explains vegetarians can eat a lot of less than ideal foods. This new paradigm is exclusively whole food, plant-based nutrition. Now, this entire train of thought, that the reason typical vegetarians don't have better stroke statistics is because they're not eating particularly stellar diets, may explain why they don't have significantly lower stroke rates, but that still doesn't explain why they might have higher stroke rates. Right? Even if they're just eating similarly crappy, salty, processed diets, at least they're not eating meat, which we know increases stroke risk. Right? So there must be something about vegetarian diet that so increases stroke risk that it offsets their inherent advantages. We'll continue our hunt next.
Okay, so even though at this point we haven't yet got to the mechanism for the increased risk, it's coming, don't worry. There are a bunch of important takeaways that I'd like people to take away from this video, right? Just because you're eating vegetarian or vegan does not mean you're eating healthy, right? From a health standpoint, calling yourself vegetarian is like identifying yourself as a no Twinkie-atarian. That's great that you don't eat Twinkies, but what's the rest of your diet like, right? All right, next we'll explore the possibility that animal fat or animal protein could be protective against stroke. Wait, what? Where would anyone get that idea? Well, let's find out together right now.
As Japan westernized, their stroke rate plummeted. Stroke was the leading cause of death in Japan, but the mortality rate sharply decreased as they moved away from their traditional diets and started eating more like those in the West. So maybe there was a protective effect of all the extra meat and dairy they started to eat. After all, their animal fat and animal protein intake were going up. At the same time, their stroke rates were going down. Protection from stroke by eating animal foods? Surely not, commented a noted Loma Linda cardiology professor. Many vegetarians, like myself, have almost come to expect the data to indicate that they have an advantage, whatever the disease that's being considered. Thus, it is disquieting to find evidence in a quite different direction for at least one subtype of stroke. Can dietary saturated fat like that found in meat and dairy be beneficial in the prevention of stroke risk? There appeared to be a protective association, but only in East Asian populations. High dietary saturated fat was found associated with a lower risk of stroke in Japanese, but not in non-Japanese. So what was it about the traditional Japanese diet where the westernization of their diets made things better when it came to stroke risk? Well, at the same time their meat and dairy was going up, their salt intake was going down. The traditional Japanese diet was packed with salt. In fact, they had some of the highest salt intakes in the world, like a dozen spoonfuls of salt a day. Before the widespread availability of refrigeration, they ate all sorts of salted, pickled, fermented foods, from soy sauce to salted fish. And in the areas that had twice the salt intake, they had twice the stroke mortality. But when the salt intake dropped, so did the stroke death rates, because when the salt came down, their blood pressures came down too. And high blood pressure is perhaps the single most important modifiable risk factor for stroke. So it's no big mystery why the westernization of the Japanese diet led to a drop in stroke risk. When they abandoned their more traditional diets, their obesity rates went up, their diabetes and coronary artery disease went up. But as they gave up the insanely high salt intake, their insanely high stroke rates correspondingly fell. It's like if you look at their stomach cancer rates, a cancer closely associated with excess salt intake. Their stomach rates came down beautifully as they westernized their diets away from salt-preserved foods. But of course, as they started eating more animal foods like dairy, their rates of fatal prostate cancer, for example, shot through the roof. Right? Compared to Japan, not only does the U.S. have 7 times more deaths from prostate cancer, but 5 times more deadly breast cancer, 3 times more colon cancer and lymphoma mortality, and 6 to 12 times the death rate from heart disease. Yes, Japanese stroke and stomach cancer rates were higher, but they were also eating up to 6 spoonfuls of salt a day. That would seem to be the most likely explanation, rather than some protective role of animal fat, as eventually acknowledged by the official Japanese guidelines for the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Now, one of the Harvard cohorts found a protective association between both saturated fat and trans fat for hemorrhagic strokes, prompting a sigh of relief throughout the cattle-producing Midwest, even though the researchers clearly concluded that, of course, we all have to cut down on animal fat and trans fat for the heart disease benefit regardless. But looking at another major Harvard cohort, they found no such protective association for any kind of stroke, and put all the studies together, and 0 protection across the board. Observational studies have found that higher LDL cholesterol seems to be associated with lower risk of hemorrhagic stroke, raising the possibility that cholesterol may be a double-edged sword, right? Decreasing the risk of ischemic stroke, but increasing the risk of hemorrhagic stroke. But low cholesterol levels in the aged may just be a surrogate for nutrient deficiencies, or a sign of debilitating diseases, or maybe they're on a combo of cholesterol-lowering drugs and blood thinners, and that's why we tend to see more brain bleeds in those with low cholesterol. You don't know until you put it to the test. Right? Put together about 24 randomized controlled trials, and the lower your cholesterol, the better when it comes to overall stroke risk, with no significant increases in the risk of hemorrhagic stroke risk, with lower achieved LDL cholesterol levels. The genetic data appears mixed, with some suggesting a lifetime of elevated LDL would give you a higher hemorrhagic stroke risk, and other data suggesting more of a double-edged sword effect. But any possible excess of bleeding stroke with lower cholesterol is greatly outweighed by the protective effect against the much more common clotting stroke, not to mention heart disease. Perhaps on the order of 18 fewer clotting strokes for every 1 extra bleeding stroke with cholesterol lowering. How about this as a candidate to explain the increased stroke risk among vegetarians? This is the type of stroke that appeared higher in vegetarians, but the cholesterol levels in vegans were even lower, and if anything, they had a trend towards a higher clotting stroke risk. So that doesn't really make sense. If there's some kind of protective factor in animal foods, is to be hoped that a diet can be found that still protects against killer number 1, heart disease, without increasing the risk of killer number 5, stroke. But first we have to figure out what that factor is, a hunt that will continue next.
So, just like the traditional Japanese diet had lots of things going for it, but it had that high sodium as the fatal flaw, what might be the Achilles heel of plant-based diets when it comes to stroke risk? If the notion that animal fat was somehow protective struck you as strange, well, you'll likely have the same reaction to the speculation that it might be the animal protein instead.
In 2014, a study on dietary protein intake and stroke risk found that greater intake was associated with lower stroke risk, and furthermore, it was the animal protein that appeared to be particularly protective. Might that help explain why vegetarians were recently found to have a higher stroke rate than meat eaters? Animal protein consumption increases the level of a cancer-promoting growth hormone in the body, known as IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which can accelerate the progression of precancerous changes to invasive cancer. High blood concentrations are associated with increased risk of breast, prostate, colorectal, and lung cancers, potentially explaining the association between dairy milk and prostate cancer risk, for example. But there are also IGF-1 receptors on blood vessels, so maybe IGF-1 promotes cancer, but also brain artery integrity? People who have strokes appear to have lower blood levels of IGF-1, but it could just be a consequence of the stroke rather than the cause. There weren't any prospective studies over time until 2017. And indeed, higher IGF-1 levels were linked to lower risk of stroke. But is it cause and effect? In mice, the answer appears to be yes. And in a petri dish, IGF-1 appears to boost production of elastin, a stretchy protein that helps keep our arteries elastic. Higher levels are associated with less artery stiffness, but acromegaly patients like Andre the Giant, those with excessive levels of growth hormones like IGF-1, do not appear to have lower stroke rates, and a more recent study of dietary protein intake and risk of stroke, looking at a dozen studies of more than 500,000 people compared to only 7 studies with 250,000 in the previous analysis, found no association between dietary protein intake and the risk of stroke. In fact, if anything, dietary plant protein intake may actually decrease the risk of stroke. However, those with high blood pressure who have low IGF-1 levels do appear to be at increased risk of developing atherosclerosis, thickening of the artery walls leading up to the brain, but no such association was found in people with normal blood pressure. So there may be a cautionary lesson for vegans here. Yes, a whole food plant-based diet to downregulate IGF-1 activity may slow the human aging process, not to mention reduce the risk of some of the most common cancers that plague the Western world. But perhaps the take-home message should be that people who undertake to downregulate IGF-1 activity by cutting down on animal protein as a pro-longevity measure should take particular care to control their blood pressure, to preserve their cerebrovascular health, the health of the arteries in their brain. Right? In particular, they should keep salt intake relatively low, while ensuring an ample intake of potassium to keep their blood pressures down. So that means avoiding processed foods and avoiding adding salt, and in terms of potassium-rich foods, beans, sweet potatoes, and dark green leafy vegetables. So, might this explain the higher stroke risk found among vegetarians? No. Why? Because dairy and egg whites are animal proteins too. Only vegans have lower IGF-1 levels in both men and women. Right? So low IGF-1 levels can't explain why higher rates of stroke were found in vegetarians. Right? So what is it already? Right? I think the best explanation for the mystery is something called homocysteine, which I'll cover next.
Wow, that was a bit of a roller coaster of a video. Well, OK, but now for the rest of the webinar, we'll just be talking about what I think is actually going on. Not taking a vitamin B12 supplements or regulating B12 fortified foods, explaining the higher stroke risk among those eating more plant-based diets.
Leonardo da Vinci had a stroke. Might his vegetarian diet been to blame? His stroke may have been related to an increase in homocysteine level because of the long duration of his vegetarian diet. A suboptimal intake of vitamin B12, which is common in those eating plant-based diets unless they take a B12 supplement or eat B12 fortified foods regularly, can lead to an increased level of homocysteine in the blood, which is accepted as an important risk factor for stroke. Accepted may be overstating it. I mean, there's still controversy surrounding the connection between homocysteine and stroke risk, but those with higher homocysteine levels do seem to have more atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries that lead up to the brain compared to those with single-digit homocysteine levels, and do seem to be at higher risk of clotting strokes in observational studies, and more recently bleeding strokes, as well as increased risk of dying from cardiovascular disease, as well as all causes put together. Even more convincing is the genetic data. About 10% of the population has a gene that increases homocysteine levels about 2 points, and they do appear to have significantly higher odds of having a stroke. Most convincing would be randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials to prove homocysteine lowering with B vitamins can lower strokes, and that indeed appears to be the case for clotting strokes. Strokes with homocysteine-lowering interventions more than 5 times as likely to reduce stroke compared to placebo. Ironically, one of the arguments against the role of homocysteine in strokes is that, assuming that vegetarians have lower vitamin B12 levels, then the incidence of stroke should be increased among vegetarians, but supposedly this wasn't the case. But it had never been tested, never been studied until now, and vegetarians do appear to be at higher risk, and no wonder, as about a quarter of vegetarians and nearly 3/4 of the vegans studied were B12 depleted or deficient, resulting in extraordinarily high homocysteine levels. Why so much B12 deficiency? Because only a small minority were taking a dedicated B12 supplement. And unlike the U.S., B12 fortification of organic foods isn't allowed. So while U.S. soy milk and other products may be fortified with B12, U.K. products may not. We don't see the same problem among U.S. vegans in the Adventist study, presumed to be because of the B12 fortification of commonly eaten foods. It may be no coincidence that the only study I was able to find that showed a significantly lower stroke mortality risk among vegetarians was an Adventist study. But start eating strictly plant-based without B12 fortified foods or supplements, and B12 deficiency can develop, but that was only for those not eating sufficient foods fortified with B12. Those eating plant-based not being careful about getting a regular, reliable source of B12 have lower B12 levels and, consequently, higher homocysteine levels. The only way to prove vitamin B12 deficiency is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease in vegetarians is to put it to the test. And when researchers measured the amount of atherosclerosis in the carotid arteries, the main arteries supplying the brain, between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, no significant difference was found. They both look just as bad, even though vegetarians tend to have better risk factors, such as cholesterol and blood pressure. They suggest B12 deficiency is playing a role, but how do they know? Some measures of artery function weren't any better either. Again, they surmise vitamin B12 deficiency overwhelming the natural plant-based benefits. Yes, the beneficial effects of vegetarian diets on cholesterol and blood sugars need to be advocated, but the necessity to correct vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarian diets cannot be overstated. Sometimes vegetarians did even worse. Worse artery wall thickness, worse artery wall function, raising concern more than a decade before the new stroke study about the vascular health of vegetarians. Yes, their B12 was low. Yes, their homocysteine was high, suggesting that vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarians might have adverse effects on their vascular health. But what you would need is an interventional study, where you give them B12 and see if that fixes it. And here we go, double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized crossover study, and the title gives it away. Vitamin B12 supplementation improves arterial function in vegetarians with subnormal vitamin B12 status. So that may explain it, right? Compromised vitamin B12 status among those eating more plant-based due to not taking B12 supplements or regularly eating vitamin B12 fortified foods may explain the higher stroke risk found among vegetarians. Unfortunately, many vegetarians resist taking vitamin B12 supplements due to misconceptions like holding on to the old myth that deficiency of this vitamin is rare among plant-based eaters. A common mistake is to think that the presence of dairy products and eggs in the diet, as in a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, can still ensure proper intake of B12 despite excluding meat. And now that we may have nailed the cause, maybe future studies should focus on identifying ways of convincing vegetarians to routinely take vitamin B12 supplements in order to prevent a deficiency.
There is lots more to say about this, lots more videos coming up, but it is time, in fact, 2 minutes too late, time to take a break. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will be back to continue the webinar. right, lots of great B12 questions are pouring in. Fantastic. Looking forward to getting to your questions. Note I recently updated my recommendations for B12 supplementation. You can always find my latest recommendations here. I just pasted the link into the chat box to my Optimum Nutrition page. Here, this is what it looks like. All right, and so if you go to that link, this is where you will end up. And if you look at the B12 section, you'll see that I now suggest at least 2,000 micrograms of cyanocobalamin once each week. There are a bunch of different types of B12, like methylcobalamin, but you want cyanocobalamin. I'm going to do a whole nother webinar about all this, but for now, 2,000 micrograms of cyanocobalamin once a week, ideally as a chewable, sublingual, or liquid supplement taken on an empty stomach, or at least 50 micrograms daily of supplemental cyanocobalamin. Now, you could also do servings of B12 fortified foods at each meal, as long as they contain at least 190% of the daily value listing based on the new Nutrition Facts label. So if you have an old label sitting around, it may not, it may be different. And note, those over age 65 basically really only have one option, and that's taking 1,000 micrograms a day of the cyanocobalamin. And of course, I'd be happy to answer any and all B12 questions you may have at the end. But in terms of the rest of this webinar, why isn't this the end of the webinar? I mean, didn't we just figure out the mystery? Well, first, I wanted to clear up some things about B12 testing. Now that I just reminded you about how important your B12 status is, so let's do that next.
Two cases of young, strictly vegetarian individuals with no known vascular risk factors, yet suffering a stroke or multiple strokes. Why? Most probably because they weren't taking vitamin B12 supplements, which leads to high homocysteine levels, which can attack your arteries. So those eating plant-based failing to supplement may increase one's risk of both heart disease and stroke. Now, vegetarians have so much heart disease risk factor benefit that they're still at lower risk overall, but this may help explain why vegetarians were found to have more stroke. Presumably, this disparity would disappear with adequate B12 supplementation, and this benefit would grow even larger. Compared with non-vegetarians, vegetarians enjoy all these other advantages: better cholesterol, blood pressures, blood sugars, and obesity rates. But what about that stroke study? And even among studies that show benefits, they're not as pronounced as one might expect, which may be a result of that poor vitamin B12 status. Vitamin B12 deficiency may negate some of the cardiovascular disease prevention benefits of vegetarian diet. So in order to further reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, vegetarians should be advised to use B12 supplements. How can you determine your B12 status? By the time you're symptomatic with B12 deficiency, it's too late, and initially the symptoms can be so subtle that you might even miss them. And well before you develop clinical deficiency, you develop metabolic vitamin B12 deficiency, a missed opportunity to prevent strokes, where you have enough B12 to avoid deficiency symptoms, but not enough to keep your homocysteine in check. Underdiagnosis of the condition results largely from failure to understand that a normal B12 blood level may not reflect adequate functional B12 status. The levels of B12 in your blood does not always represent the level of B12 in your cells. You can have a severe functional deficiency of B12 even though your blood levels are normal or even high. Most physicians tend to assume that if the B12 level in your blood is normal, then there's no problem. But within the lower range of normal, 30% of patients could have metabolic B12 deficiency with high homocysteine levels. Measuring methylmalonic acid levels, or homocysteine directly, are more accurate reflection of vitamin B12 functional status. Methylmalonic acid can be a simple urine test. You're looking for less than a value of 4 micrograms per milligram of creatinine. Elevated MMA is a specific marker of vitamin B12 deficiency, while homocysteine rises in the context of both vitamin B12 and folate deficiencies. And so metabolic B12 deficiency is defined by an elevation in MMA levels or by an elevation of homocysteine in people getting enough folate, even without eating beans and greens, which are packed with folate. Folic acid is added to the flour supply by law, and so high homocysteine levels these days may be mostly a B12 problem. Ideally, you're looking for a homocysteine level in your blood down in the single digits. Right? Measured this way, the prevalence of functional B12 deficiency is dramatically higher than previously assumed, like 10 to 40% of the general population, and more than 40% in vegetarians, and the majority of vegans who aren't scrupulous about getting their B12. Some suggest that those on plant-based diets check their vitamin B12 status every year, but you shouldn't need to if you're adequately supplementing. And evidently there are rare cases of vitamin B12 deficiency that can't be picked up on any test, so you better just make sure you're getting enough. Now, if you do get your homocysteine tested, and it's still up in the double digits, even despite B12 supplementation, I do have a suggestion in the final videos of this series, which we'll turn to next.
Okay, so even if the B12 levels in your blood are fine, that doesn't mean that you have optimal B12 status. For that, you need these other tests of metabolic vitamin B12 deficiency. Now, if you do get your homocysteine tested, and despite B12 supplementation, and despite eating beans and greens, it's still too high, meaning double digits, I have a suggestion. It's covered in the final 2 videos I'm going to present today before getting to your questions.
Almost universally, research findings show a poor vitamin B12 status among vegetarians because they're not taking vitamin B12 supplements like they should. And this results in an elevation of homocysteine levels that may explain why vegetarians were recently found to have higher rates of stroke. Of course, plant-based eating is just one of many ways to get B12 deficient. Even laughing gas can do it in as short as 2 days, thanks to the recreational use of whipped cream canister gas. That's something new I learned today. Anyways, if you do eat plant-based, giving vegetarians and vegans even as little as 50 micrograms once a day of cyanocobalamin, the recommended most stable form of vitamin B12 supplement, and their homocysteine levels start up in the elevated zone, and within 1 to 2 months, their homocysteines normalize right down into the safe zone under 10, or just 2,000 micrograms of cyanocobalamin once a week, and you get the same beautiful result. But not always. In this study, even 500 micrograms a day, either as a sublingual chewable or swallowable regular B12 supplement, didn't normalize homocysteine within a month. Now, presumably if they had kept it up, their levels would have continued to fall, like in the other study. But if you're plant-based, have been taking your B12 and your homocysteine levels are still too high, meaning above 10, is there anything else you can do? Now, inadequate folate intake can also increase homocysteine, but folate comes from the same root as foliage. It's found in leaves, concentrated in greens as well as beans. But if you're eating beans and greens, taking your B12 and your homocysteine level is still too high, then I'd suggest trying as an experiment, taking 1 gram of creatine a day and getting your homocysteine levels retested in a month to see if it helped. Creatine is a compound formed naturally in the human body that is primarily involved in energy production in our muscles and brain. It's also naturally formed in the bodies of many animals we eat, and so when we eat their muscles, we also can take in some creatine through our diet. We need about 2 grams a day, so those who eat meat may get like 1 gram from their diet, and their body makes the rest from scratch. There are rare birth defects where you're born without the ability to make it, in which case you have to get it from your diet, but otherwise, our bodies make as much as we need to maintain normal concentrations in our muscles. When you cut out meat, the amount of creatine floating around your bloodstream goes down, but the amount in your brain remains the same, showing dietary creatine doesn't influence the levels of brain creatine, because your brain just makes all the creatine you need. The level in vegetarian muscles is lower, but that doesn't seem to affect performance, as both vegetarians and meat eaters respond to creatine supplementation with similar increases in muscle power output. And if vegetarian muscle creatine was insufficient, then presumably they would have seen an even bigger boost. Right? So basically, all that happens when you eat meat is that your body just doesn't have to make as much. What does this all have to do with homocysteine? OK, in the process of making creatine, your body produces homocysteine as a waste product. Now, normally this isn't a problem, because your body has 2 ways to detoxify it, using vitamin B6, or using a combination of vitamins B12 and folate. Now, B6 is found in both plant and animal foods. It's rare to be deficient, but B12 is mainly in animal foods, and so it can be too low in those eating plant-based who don't supplement or eat B12 fortified foods, and folate is concentrated in plant foods, so it can be low in those who don't regularly eat greens or beans or folic acid fortified grains. And without that escape valve, homocysteine levels can get too high. If, however, you're eating a healthy plant-based diet and taking your B12 supplement, your homocysteine levels should be fine, but what if they're not? Right? One might predict that if you started taking creatine supplements, the level of homocysteine might go down, since you're not going to have to be making so much of it from scratch, producing homocysteine as a byproduct. But you don't know until you put it to the test, which we'll cover next.
This whole creatine angle was something completely new to me, which I only discovered when I dove deep into this research for you. I had long worried about homocysteine levels being too high and those getting inadequate B12 intake, but didn't realize that there was potentially another possible mechanism to bring it down other than vitamin B intake. Let's see if it pans out.
The average blood levels of homocysteine in men is about 1.5 points higher than in women. Maybe that's one of the reasons why men tend to be at higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Women don't need to make as much creatine as men, since they tend to have less muscle mass, and that may help explain the gender gap in homocysteine levels. If you remember from my last video, in the process of making creatine, your body produces homocysteine as a byproduct. So maybe for people with stubbornly high homocysteine levels that don't sufficiently respond to B vitamins, perhaps creatine supplementation may represent a practical strategy to draw homocysteine levels down into the normal range. It seemed to work in rats, but in humans it worked in one study, this one, but didn't seem to work in another study, this one, or this one. And in this study, homocysteine levels were even driven up. So this whole suggestion that taking creatine supplements would lower homocysteine was called into question. But all those studies were done in non-vegetarians, so they were effectively already supplementing with creatine every day in the form of muscle meat. So they were basically just testing higher versus lower supplementation. Those eating strictly plant-based make all their creatine from scratch, so may be more sensitive to an added creatine source. But there were never any studies on creatine supplementation in vegans for homocysteine lowering, until now. They took a bunch of vegans who were not supplementing their diets with vitamin B12, so some of their homocysteine levels were like through the roof, a few as high as 50, when the ideal is more like under 10. But after taking some creatine for a few weeks, all of their homocysteine levels normalized, before and after. Right? Now, they didn't really normalize, which would have been under 10, but that's presumably because they weren't taking any B12. Right? Give vegetarians and vegans vitamin B12 supplements, either daily dosing or once a week, and their levels really normalize in a matter of months. But the fact that even without B12, that you could bring down homocysteine levels with creatine alone suggests, to me at least, that if your homocysteine is elevated on a plant-based diet, meaning above 10, despite taking B12 supplements and eating greens and beans to get enough folate, well, then it may be worth experimenting with supplementing with a gram of creatine for a few weeks and see if your homocysteine levels come down. Why 1 gram? That's approximately how much non-vegetarians are not having to make themselves. That's how much erased vegetarian discrepancies in blood and muscle, and how much has been shown to be safe in the longer term. How safe exactly is it? Well, one can take a bit of comfort in the fact that it's one of the world's best-selling dietary supplements, with literally billions of servings taken, and the only consistently reported side effect has been weight gain, presumed to be from water retention. The only serious side effects appear to be among those with pre-existing kidney diseases, taking whopping doses like 20 grams a day. A concern was raised that creatine could potentially form a carcinogen known as N-nitrososarcosine when it hit the acid bath of the stomach, but when actually put to the test, this does not appear to be a problem. Bottom line, doses up to 3 grams a day are unlikely to pose any risk, provided high-purity creatine is used. And as we all know, dietary supplements are not regulated by the FDA, may contain contaminants, or not actually contain what's on the label. Contaminants generated during the industrial production. When researchers looked at 33 samples of creatine supplements made in the US and Europe, they all did actually contain creatine, which is nice, but about half exceeded the maximum level recommended by food safety authorities for at least one contaminant. The researchers recommend that consumers give their preference to products obtained by producers that ensure the highest quality control. Easier said than done. Because of the potential risks, I don't think people should be taking creatine supplements willy-nilly, but the potential benefits may exceed the potential risks if, again, you're on a healthy plant-based diet taking B12 and your homocysteine levels are still not under 10. I would suggest giving a gram a day of creatine a try to see if it brings it down. The reason I did this whole video series all goes back to this study, which found that although the overall cardiovascular disease risk is lower in vegetarians and vegans combined, they appeared to be at slightly higher stroke risk. I went through a list of potential causes, arrived at elevated homocysteine, and the solution, a regular, reliable source of vitamin B12. The cheapest, easiest method that I personally use is one 2,500 microgram chewable tablet of cyanocobalamin. In fact, you can just use 2,000 microgram once a week, and cyanocobalamin is the most stable source of B12. Take that once a week, and then, as I detailed in this video, a backup plan for those doing that and still having elevated homocysteine is an empirical trial of 1 gram a day of creatine supplementation, which has been shown to improve at least capillary blood flow in those who started out with high homocysteine levels. The bottom line is that plant-based diets appear to markedly reduce our risk of multiple leading killer diseases, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and many common types of cancer, but an increased risk of stroke may represent an Achilles heel. Nonetheless, they have the potential to achieve a truly exceptional health span if they face this problem forthrightly by restricting salt intake and taking other practical measures that promote brain artery health. Nonetheless, these considerations do not justify nutritional nihilism. On balance, even strictly plant-based diets offer such versatile protection to long-term health that they remain highly recommendable. Most likely, the optimum strategy is to eat plant-based, along with going out of the way to eat particularly protective foods, as I talked about before, regular aerobic exercise, and most importantly, taking your vitamin B12. Oh, and try not to huff whipped cream charging canister gas.
All right, now, I am assuming that nearly everyone who's taking their B12 will have normal homocysteine levels, right? So these last two videos, the whole creatine thing, is just for the rare person that doesn't. But those on healthy plant-based diets with elevated homocysteine levels, despite taking sufficient vitamin B12, should consider taking a gram a day of contaminant-free creatine. All right, so homocysteine levels should be fine as long as you're getting B12. But if they're not, and you're eating beans and greens, taking B12, still too high, gram a day of contaminant-free creatine. Okay, so the next question, again, for the rare individual that needs it, where do you get contaminant-free creatine? I knew people would ask that question, so I wanted to say it right up front. Because you cannot rely on supplement manufacturers no matter what they say, right? Since the regulation for dietary supplements is so lax that it's very hard to trust anything on a supplement bottle. So I would recommend for contaminant-free creatine going directly to the chemical suppliers that sell creatine to laboratories and guarantee like 99% purity. I mean, the laboratories need to have the real stuff because they're actually doing, experiments with like millions of dollars and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste a few links to such companies here in the chat. This is in alphabetical order. These are, there you go. Those are the top 4 chemical companies in the US, or at least that sell in the US. In alphabetical order, I would just buy whatever's cheapest. Note a gram a day, since they don't come in capsules, right? This is just, you're just going to get a baggie of powder in the mail. That looks suspicious, or not baggie. They'll probably send it to you in a little glass bottle. A gram a day, since you have to measure it out, will come out to be about a quarter teaspoon. So a quarter teaspoon a day would be the gram of day you need. And so if you check on any of these links, they'll sell it by like the 25 grams. That would last you about a month. Anyway, okay. Before I switch over to Q&A, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up about my next webinar. And that's the one where we're going to dive deep into vitamin B12 details. And so let me show everyone the list there. There we go. Okay, so note that my next webinar won't be until May. You say, May? Why so late? You haven't seen my speaking schedule, obviously. In fact, I leave in 2 days now for about a month. But mark your calendars for May 28th. That's a Thursday, again at 2 p.m. Eastern. So on March 28th, I'll start out with the symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency, and then talk about the optimal dose of vitamin B12 supplements in adults, children, pregnancy, and the elderly, the healthiest B12 fortified food sources for people that don't want to take supplements, why cyanocobalamin and not methylcobalamin is the best type of B12, and address the data that suggests B12 supplements may cause cancer, bone fractures, and lung cancer. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to give everyone a heads up about it before the Q&A is because, look, I'd be happy to give you all spoiler alert sneak previews of any of these topics right now, as well as any questions that came up for you from today's webinar. Okay, so let's spend the rest of the time we have together going through your questions. NutritionFacts.org staff will be posting the questions I'm answering in the chat box to help everyone kind of keep track. And so let's do it. Okay, the first question is, can I reiterate my recommendations for B12 and what's the difference between a methyl and cyano, and why don't I recommend methylcobalamin? Okay, so I'm just going to, why don't I just repaste? If you see the chat box there, I'm going to repaste my the link to my updated recommendations. This is the link you can always go to see what my current that day recommendations are. Yes, it says it's 2011, but that was just the original. That was when it went up originally 9 years ago, and then I've updated it whenever there's an update since. And then I put it out on social media. And so months ago, for those who've been following me on Facebook or wherever, I said, look, new vitamin B12 recommendations. Here they are. Go to the site. Don't worry, I'm going to have a whole series of videos going, point by point, exactly how I arrived at those. What's my, what's my rationale? But in the meanwhile, I didn't want to wait for that. Here's the new recommendations. Basically, just trust me until the videos go up. And all those videos, of course, will be in that next webinar in May. But happy to go through them now. I mean, I could literally go through the whole. In fact, one of the videos in the webinar in May, I'm going to do methyl versus cyano. If people are really interested in that, go to the Q&A button and type it in, and we will go through that whole thing. It'll just take about 5 minutes. And so we would take a kind of substantial chunk of the remaining Q&A time we have. But if that's like a really important question to a lot of people, rather than minutia to most people, then I'd be happy to go through it. But I'm going to just put that in a hold for a moment. And basically what I just said in the video here was that cyanocobalamin is more stable, meaning it's more shelf stable. So, and so that would be, if that's not good enough for you, I'll go through all the science talking about why indeed cyanocobalamin is the best if you want me to. All right, hold on. Okay, next. So we may come back to that. Are there any people, next question, are there any people who should take a source other than cyanocobalamin? What about adenozylcobalamin or hydroxycobalamin in order to supply different purpose? I talk about all those different types and why cyanocobalamin is really the best, though I raise questions about smokers and those centering their diets around cassava. Cyanocobalamin for the vast majority of people who with the normal kidney function. Next question, and again, I'd be happy to go through it. I ask that question again, and I'll be happy to go through that whole video, or the script of the video. The video isn't even made yet, but I can go through the script. Okay, what are my recommendations for children, age 12 through 17, in terms of vitamin B12 for adults? I think I have that in a PDF. I was expecting people might ask that question. So let me share the PDF and we can go through it. Here we go. PDF, PDF expert. Okay, there we go. All right, you should now be seeing a PDF. This is, just to give you the source, Vegan Nutrition for Mothers and Children, Practical Tools for Healthcare Providers in a journal called Nutrients, which was published in 2019. And so if you look at table 2, I hope you can see my little mouse here. For pregnant and lactating women, it's the same as adults. So you can see here, for adults or children 11 and above, it's either 50 a day or 2,000 a week. Like I said before, again, this is for cyanocobalamin. And then for pregnant breastfeeding women, we have the same thing, though they suggest during pregnancy taking the dose of 2 separate halves may increase bioavailability. Now, here's the children. 6 months to 3 years, instead of taking 50 a day, only need 5 micrograms a day. And then for children aged 4 through 10, 25. So they're taking half the daily dose. And we have not yet had weekly doses. We don't yet know what the weekly dose is for children. It is, however, all water-soluble vitamins, so you'll just get expensive pee if you take too much. All right. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that and getting back to your questions. Is there any specific brand of vitamin B12 or vitamin D that I recommend? Okay, so I just got through saying you don't believe what supplement companies say, right? Whatever they say, they're like, this is pure, this is contaminant free, this actually contains what we say it contains. Bullshit. They're just trying to sell you something. They could say basically anything on the label. But so what you need is third-party certification. And the most stringent is what's called USP certification. So basically you look for something that has USP verified. There's a little badge that goes on supplements that have been USP verified. All that means, it doesn't say it's good. That doesn't mean it's good for you, right? All it says is that what it says on the label is what's actually inside. It doesn't seem like it'd be a high bar. But look, for something as important as vitamin B12, for example, you want to make sure that whatever the supplement you're taking actually has vitamin B12 in it. And so there are a couple brands that have been USP certified. Here, I will switch over. And you know, I hate talking about brands. I hate talking, but I just want to show you some examples, so you kind of know what to look for. So let me share once again. Okay, here we go. Here we are on Amazon. So Kirkland Signature. If you see right here, see that? That's the USP verified. This you can take half of one of these once a week. That would be more than the 2,000 you need. God, this is 300 tablets. So that's 12 years worth for $23. So it's like, it's like $2 a year. All right. Okay, here's another one. This is Nature Made, and there it is, USP certified. And there's a bunch of different doses. Do I endorse these brands? No, but they are USP certified, meaning they paid money to an independent third party to test their products to make sure it actually contained what it said it contained. What a concept. All right. Oh, and in terms of vitamin D, let me see. There are a few that have been Nature Made and Kirkland Signature also make vitamin D, as well as Nature's Bounty. There's a Nature's Bounty. But again, the bottle actually has to have the USP verified on it. Otherwise, it's not USP verified. And the reason why most supplements don't have it is because it's expensive to do and they don't think people care. But I think people should care what they're putting into their body. Okay, next question. How are we doing on time? We've got about 20 minutes left. Is there a better absorption method for B12, liquid, tablet, or injection? Well, injection, you don't have to worry about absorption because you're sticking it into your body, but that can be painful and have side effects that we don't want. The important thing, the reason why I suggest to take liquid, sublingual, chewable is because ideally it should mix with your saliva. Because there's actually something in your saliva that binds to B12 and protects it through the digestive tract, so it's optimally absorbed. And so that's why I don't recommend taking B12 as part of a multivitamin. So let's say you take a multivitamin and you're like, oh, I got all the B12 I need. I don't have to worry about B12. Wrong, because there are other compounds in the multivitamin, like copper, that can actually damage the B12 and turn it into a B12 analog, which looks like B12. And so your body thinks it's B12, absorbs it like B12, but it's actually not usable by your body. So it can be like anti-B12. That's not what you want. And if you've ever tried to chew a multivitamin, you know what I'm talking about. The same thing with a B complex, right? A B complex, you say, well, get all the Bs together. Well, you don't need all the Bs together. You should get all your nutrients, with the exception of vitamin B12 and vitamin D, from the produce aisle, and vitamin D from walking into the store, getting some sunshine before you walk to the produce aisle. Vitamin B12, however, is not found there. And so you need to get a regular, reliable source. Because you want to chew it up, you want to mix it with your saliva. So it can be either liquid, chewable, sublingual, whatever. You know, when they say sublingual, you don't actually have to stick it under your tongue and let it dissolve. You just chew it up. But the fact that it's sublingual means it's chewable, won't probably taste too nasty. Although some have this nasty cherry flavor, which I can't stand, but oh well. So yeah, mixed with your saliva. Oh, and on an empty stomach, that would also improve absorption. Okay, next up, there seems to be some talk recently, about getting too much B12. All right. Okay, so here we are in another scenario here. So I have videos on B12 and acne, B12 and bone fractures, B12 and lung cancer. I would be happy to go through those scripts right now as kind of sneak preview spoiler alerts. These are going to be the videos that I'm going to put in the May webinar. Trying to see what we should do. Okay, so if you want me to talk about can you get too much B12, type that right now into the Q&A section. And if NutritionFacts.org staff see tons of those questions, I will go through the script right now and we'll do it. Otherwise, let me move on. But I will come back to it if indeed you want me to cover that. Okay. Okay. Next question. Does fortified nutritional yeast have enough vitamin B12? It depends. You've got to look at the label. And most don't have enough at a typical serving served once a day. Or even actually 3 times a day. And it's actually, so I have a video. Here we go again. I have a video where I go through every single brand of nutritional yeast on the market. Everything one I can find. I only found about 8 brands. And I go through exactly how much they have, exactly how much you take, exactly how much. It's like nutritional yeast on steroids. And if you want me to do that, right now, Q&A, nutritional yeast, please. And I will go through that script. I'm just trying to pick and choose because we have limited time. But I knew that'd be a good question. And so I went through every single brand on the market. And I even called them up when the things were unclear, when they were changing their labels. All right, so I got good data for everybody. Okay, next question. According to prof in clinical, presumably a professor in clinical dietetics, the reason we give pregnant women folic acid instead of B12 is there's a slight risk of getting too much. You know about this slight risk. No, I mean, the reason we give pregnant women folic acid is because we assume that pregnant women are not going to be eating beans and greens. Why? Because 96% of Americans don't reach the recommended minimum daily intake of legumes, your beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils. I certainly know 99% don't reach the minimum for whole grains. I'm not sure what it is for greens, but I'm sure it's way up there in the 95% plus of Americans don't eat enough beans and greens, and not having enough during pregnancy can lead to a very serious neural tube defect, birth defect. And so that's why they give it to it, where they assume pregnant women are eating meat because most women eat meat. And so they're like, well, you're going to get B12. And most women also drink dairy, which would have B12 in it as well. Or so that's why they supplement with folic acid, not B12. Although I have videos talking about how folic acid is actually not the best way to get folate. Our body turns folic acid into folate, but not as well as rodents do it, and can lead to high circulating levels of folic acid, which may increase cancer risk. Best way to get folate is through eating beans and greens. One of the reasons why my daily dozen checklist of all the healthiest foods I encourage people to fit into their daily routine, I include both beans and greens. In fact, 3 servings of legumes a day, as well as 2 servings of dark green leafy vegetables and a 3rd serving of cruciferous vegetables, which very often is dark green leafy as well, like arugula, kale, collards, etc. Okay, all right. So I got the polling results are in, and yes, people really do want me to go through the scripts on too much B12. So let us do that right now. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so I'm going to, okay, why don't I will share my slide here. Okay, everyone should be looking at my little finder here. Here are the upcoming videos. How exciting, aluminum pots, dun dun dun, Teflon. Oh, no, we don't want to do aluminum pots, Teflon. Anyway, here's the B12 videos coming up. Ooh, what about pole walking, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And here are the B12 supplements, volume 52. It's going to be, wait till the end of the year when these finally pop up, but you'll get them all, of course, in the webinar in May, but you can get them right now because I'm going to do it right now. So let us, first we'll do acne, then we'll do bone fractures and lung cancer. Okay, so let me switch us over. Okay, I'm going to now, I don't know if we've ever done this before, actually sharing a script, but this is behind the scenes at Nutrition Facts. This is what I do. This is what me scripting out the videos. And then I give this to the video team and they produce magic, produce all those videos. And so you can see I have this 1Y. That means bring up PDF 1 and the yellow quote in PDF 1 and poof, show that while I read this sentence and then do all this other stuff. Okay, so the brackets are just my notations for the video people. Okay, so let's see about acne. So you can read along with me. First paragraph just talks about why people get acne. So usually start out videos with some interesting like tidbits. All right, but let's move down. Universal skin disease afflicting 95% of Americans, but not everybody. There are some people that don't get any at all. And then I talk about the risk factors, highly glycemic foods and dairy products, blah, blah, blah. And so they should stop taking whey protein, milk, and we should stop drinking milk, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and so, but let's get down to the B12 stuff. Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, so, okay. So B12 induce acnes. And our fellow grade A herbivores like gorillas get all the B12 they need, eating bugs, dirt, and feces, but my preference is supplement, but you don't have to worry about getting too much because there's no reports of adverse effects, right? That's the standard line, but that's not true. Dun, dun, dun. First described back in the 1950s, about 1 in 10 people erupt in acne within days or even hours of getting an injection of vitamin B12, and then you stop the B12 and the acne goes away. That's one of the reasons we know it's actually happening. And we didn't know what the mechanism is, but it's really cool. We actually had to know exactly what the mechanism is in terms of what B12, when you take it, exudes out into your skin, the skin bacteria use it to do all sorts of things, blah, blah, blah. So wait a second. If B12 can cause acne, what do we do about it? It's just B12 injections, right? So what do we do? Those on plant-based diets, we have to take B12. Yes, but we don't need injections. So this only occurs when you take 5,000 to 10,000 a week, right? And I'm only recommending 2,000 a week. And the only reason you'd have to take 5,000 to 10,000 a week is if you're treating B12 deficiency. And so don't get B12 deficient. And so you don't need B12 injections. You can take them orally. And so B12, bottom line, B12 injections can cause acne. 1 in 10 people, 90% of people, even with B12 injections, don't get acne, but you don't have to worry about it if you just take oral doses. All right, we are done with that. Let's move on to lung cancer and bone fractures. If you have any questions about the acne, we can go back to that. All right, I'm gonna pull up the lung cancer one and switch over. I hope that seeing these scripts is useful. I don't know. Okay, in 2019, study was published finding that high intakes of vitamins B12 and B6 from food and supplements increase risk of hip fracture, Harvard nurses study, but note it was only combined intake of B12 and B6, and we know that B6 alone increases hip fracture risk, and so it turns out that no, it's only those taking B6, not those taking B12. Okay. Yes, and so that's indeed what the Harvard study found. High intakes of B12 alone did not increase risk of hip fractures. In fact, maybe a lower hip fracture risk, blah, blah, blah. In conclusion, based on randomized controlled trials, high doses of vitamin B12 not shown to increase risk of fractures. Boom. All right. Phew. Next. What about this? A 2017 study, PDF number 1. which of course I'll show in the video. A study found that men taking B12 supplements appeared to have increased risk in lung cancer. They did not find it associated with women, and it was mostly among smoking men. So could it be that B12 was like feeding some budding tumors? It's hard to imagine B12 being carcinogenic on its own, but and then wait, how in men, not women? Anyway, the bottom line was that we really need to replicate this study. And indeed, when you put all the studies together, no significant correlation between levels of B12 in your blood and lung cancer, and that's whether you smoke or not. If anything, higher B12 trended to be protective. But then, dun, 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 2018, new study. Found association between overall lung cancer risk and higher circulating levels of B12. Again, more of a smoker thing. And now, of course, this is just an observational study saying high B12 levels associated with higher cancer. And as you know, anyone who follows my work knows the drill. Two ways you can get two problems with observational studies that prevent you from ascribing cause and effect, confounding factors, and reverse causation, right? So what might the lurker variable or confounding variable be? A third factor associated with both high B12 and high cancer rates that may be the true cause. Well, who has higher levels of B12 in their blood? Those who eat lots of meat and dairy. In fact, probably the most important contributors. And so those who eat more meat have more lung cancer. Duh. And this is how much more lung cancer they have eating meat. And so no wonder why you'd have higher B12 levels would cause more lung cancer. So B12 just can be a marker for meat intake. And if you remember reverse causation, we just covered it actually in this webinar, where instead of X leading to Y, maybe Y is instead leading to X. Instead of high B12 levels leading to cancer, maybe cancer leads to high B12 levels. And indeed, nearly 3/4 of cancer patients have really high B12 levels in their blood. And so it just may be a marker for cancer. And there's all sorts of talk about all sorts of things that can increase your B12 levels in your blood. So it just be me a marker of brewing yet to be diagnosed cancer. But finally, okay, but what about those linking not just B12 levels, but actually taking supplements to lung cancer? And that too could be reverse causation, where being at risk for cancer, like if you're a smoker, makes you want to, hey, take vitamins to decrease your risk. Basically, anything tied to smoking could be indirectly tied to lung cancer, but it's the smoking itself that's the real lung cancer risk. So we're left with this chicken and egg causality dilemma, which is why we need dun, 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 randomized controlled trials to prove cause and effect. And thankfully, bum, 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 we didn't have any until now. Over a dozen randomized controlled trials, randomizing thousands of people up to my 2,000 micrograms every day. I only say once a week. For years. That's a lot of B12 and dun, 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 no effect on getting cancer, dying from cancer, dying overall, and specifically including lung cancer. And if anything, B supplements actually lower the risk of the most dangerous form of skin cancer called melanoma. So don't worry about getting too much B12. You just pee it out, but take supplements, not injections. Whew. All right, let's get back to your questions. Okay. I got a note from staff saying tomorrow is my live Q&A day. So I'm doing live Q&As on both Facebook and YouTube. Let me look up the times really quick. Tomorrow, Facebook Live at noon Eastern time, and then the YouTube Live at 1 p.m. And on the homepage of Nutrition Facts, there will be a link, a banner with a link tomorrow to the YouTube, and then you can just go to the Facebook page for the Facebook Live, because I know I only got 4 more minutes, and there's tons more questions, so I will answer them tomorrow, and people will be like, wow, people are so smart. Where do they get these great B12 questions? Well, they just saw this webinar today. All right, anyway, let's see if I can do some rapid fire for all these other ones. Do statins impact vitamin B12 levels negatively? Not that I'm aware of, but metformin, which is a diabetes drug, can, which just makes more certain that you got to make sure you get enough B12. Are there other ways to lower homocysteine other than B12 supplementation? Yes. Eating beans and greens, you get folate, and pretty much everyone gets B6 and maybe the creatine. Does creatine raise TMAO levels? No, you are thinking of carnitine. Carnitine, found predominantly in red meat, but also in energy drinks as well as carnitine supplements, is what's used by bad bacteria to create toxic TMAO, trimethylamine N-oxide. All right. Oh, but that was kind of a similar. It sounds similar, so totally understand where you get that. Is creatine supplementation safe for those with chronic kidney disease? It depends how bad your kidney disease is, but at 1 gram a day, it should not be a problem. But that is such a broad term, chronic kidney disease, that I encourage you to ask your physician. But 1 gram a day is what people get normally every day in their regular diet. The next question, is there any way to intake creatine naturally, not as a supplement? Yes, you could eat mussels, which is how most people get it. You could eat mussel meat, but of course, food is a package deal, and so you can't get it from eating a steak without getting the things that you don't want in a steak, like the saturated fat and cholesterol and hormones, etc., antibiotics. All right. Can I please repeat the best way to test for creatine and homocysteine? So we're not testing for creatine. We're testing, you can get a test for homocysteine. It's called just serum homocysteine level. You can, now I think you can actually just order test yourself if you want, right? There's like labs like Quest Labs where you don't even need a doctor's order, but presumably your insurance won't pay for it unless your doctor orders it. So you can ask your doctor to order a homocysteine level. And again, we want less than 10. We want single digits homocysteine. Of course, but you have to be, the most important thing, you're taking B12, you're eating plant-based diet, healthy plant-based diet, taking B12, your homocysteine levels should be fine. But if it's not, that's where the creatine comes in. And again, hopefully that'll be clear once we send you all these videos and you can watch them again and be like, oh, I get it now. I'm sorry, I kind of rushed through these. All right. Isn't low vitamin D a risk factor for homocysteine? Not that I know of. You mentioned a gene that causes higher homocysteine level. Oh yes, there's a number of different genes that can increase homocysteine level from a number of different pathways. I don't think it'd be useful to get into that. What about vitamin D lowering sleep or increased sleep apnea? Not that I know of. So vitamin D interfering with sleep, that is not something I've ever heard, but if you know something that I don't, and there's lots out there that I don't know, send it to me. And if it's interesting, groundbreaking, and practical, I'll do a video about it. What about, okay, so we did that. So for those who are genetically lower vitamin D, do they have physiological compensation? Do they suffer the same risks and health problems as people who have higher levels genetically? I ask because practically every client I see these days, their MD has them on a vitamin D supplement. For those genetically lower vitamin D, the reason we look at genetically specified levels of vitamin D is because that allows us to do what are called Mendelian randomization studies, where then we can see, independent of sunshine, if people just going their whole lives with lower D levels actually have higher levels of purported vitamin D deficiency diseases. And that's how we found that, oh, actually diabetes has nothing to do with vitamin D. And that's how, I go through, I have lots of videos on vitamin D on the site saying we thought this had something to do. Nope, absolutely we don't have, we know it has nothing to do with it. But vitamin D does play a role in a bunch of things. But that's one of the ways we figure it out. But if you have low vitamin D levels, then you can raise them by either supplementation or getting adequate sunshine. Of course, I've got lots of videos on those too. And we are out of time. I am so sorry. Wow. That just buzzed by. Okay, remember, there are questions. We could, I have two live Q&As tomorrow to answer any other questions you may have. Okay. Hope you learned a ton. Hope certainly I did, right? I learned just as much as anyone doing these videos. Like I never knew about the creatine thing until I sat down and looked at this. And so thanks to you, I was able to learn something and share something. And so I appreciate those, all of you for making a donation to NutritionFacts.org by joining this webinar so I can keep doing what I do. I hope to see everyone out there on the road this year. See you later and hope to hear from you tomorrow on the Q&A.